Welcome back. We're going to continue our conversation and now move out of security and talk a little bit about information security management. We're still at the introductory level. We're still in Chapter 1 of the book, but we're going to look at a couple of the characteristics associated with management. So here's the agenda we're going to follow. We'll look at the objectives, see what we've covered thus far and what we've got in front of us. We'll then talk about management and information security management. We'll hold off on project management. That actually will be a different YouTube movie forthcoming. But before we get into that, of course, we got to go back to our favorite cube of all time. We've got to talk about the CNSS security model. And again, as you start to look at this particular model, those characteristics of confidentiality, integrity, and availability associated with information, you look at the tools along that path: policy, education, and technology, and then you look at the different stages. We're going to focus a little bit today on those stages, okay? And actually, we're going to relate them back to availability. So let's think about that again. Availability is this idea: can I get to the information? And if I can block people getting to the information, then potentially I can cause some problems for that. So again, if you're at running Amazon and someone can block getting to Amazon, that's a computer information security attack, and then they can use that to extort money. And if you think about it, the attack I just described is one that involved transmission. You often will hear in the press a denial of service attack or distributed denial of service attack. Well, that's an availability attack against transmission. But there are also attacks that look at availability for storage or processing, and actually they're quite common. And they use that to break into the machine or to deny that machine from accomplishing its intended task. And this actually goes all the way back to one of the first recorded worm attacks, the Morris worm from 1988. As the worm was replicating through 6,000 different machines across the internet back then, and 6,000 machines was a large portion of the internet back then, the worm would replicate so rapidly due to what many believe was just an error in the code that it would exhaust all of the processors, and it would, because all the processors were doing at that point was processing thousands upon thousands of copies of this worm instead of doing any real work. And it would exhaust the storage in holding the thousands upon thousands of copies of this particular program. And it wasn't a very long program, but again, if you do it many times over, you get into a real issue. So this idea of availability relates to attacks in storage, processing, and transmission. It may be an attack against Amazon or World of Warcraft or a commercial retail site. It could be an attack against processing and storage, where the availability of that processor or the availability of online storage is not there because it's been filled due to a malicious attack. All right, so very good. Again, you're going to come to love this security model. It really is a mechanism for analyzing attacks, if you will. I just analyzed two different types of attacks. Actually, three. I talked about denial of service, talked about a distributed denial of service, which I guess is a variant of that, talked about worm attacks and what they do in their attacks on availability of information. Now, the Morris worm actually did attack confidentiality and integrity as well, but availability was a component of that. All right, well, very, very good. Again, favorite chart of all times. Hopefully you're just going to love this chart, and as you start thinking about security, this picture just pops in your mind. If you're a two-dimensional kind of thinker, you're going to use that image on the left. If you're three-dimensional, you use the image on the right, but it'll help you as you analyze different security attacks and figure out what you should do to address those attacks. So going back on availability, how would you counter that? Well, you could counter that, if you think about it, by having additional resources, by having pre-existing contracts that allow you to surge your resources, by distributing it where you can block specific types of attacks coming in as you're going forward. And so, again, there are mechanisms for this, but for availability, the more you have, the easier you can survive. And sometimes you pre-negotiate that to allow you to surge. And sometimes you block. If you can identify where those attacks are coming from, you can block that attack coming forward. But again, things are getting a little bit more sophisticated. You can now go to websites and say, hey, I want to take out this particular web address for this day at this time, and then contract with a criminal organization to actually do that. And there's been some humorous stories about students doing that so they didn't have to take exams. But it's actually quite serious. All right, let's move forward. We've done our little review of CNSS, and we're going to come back and see this again in subsequent presentations. But I did want to spend a little bit of time and talk about storage, processing, and transmission. Make sure you were comfortable with those ideas of, where you're storing information out on a hard drive or in RAM, processing it on the CPU, the central processing unit, or transmitting it across the internet or some other form of connectivity. So when we look at our lesson objectives, we've already covered the first of those 4 objectives. We're going to cover the second and third objective during this video, and then we'll hold off on that 4th one to cover it in a different video. All right, so let's talk now for a second about management. Management, as described on the slide, is this process of achieving objectives using a given set of resources. So it's all about that resource management and having processes in place that allow you to effectively utilize those resources. When you look at leadership, you've got 3 different styles there. This idea of autocratic, do as I say, democratic, do as the group says, or laissez-faire, do just enough to keep moving forward. And if you think about that and you think about your experiences in life, you've probably run across some autocratic leaders where it's do as I say. There's not going to be a debate about this. And of course, the most dangerous autocratic leaders are the ones who have no clue what they're doing, but they're out there. But there is a place for autocratic leadership. When a child is about to put their hand on the stove, you want to be autocratic. There's not going to be a vote on whether the child puts the hand on the stove. You don't want a laissez-faire approach to that. Well, we'll let the child put the hand on the stove and see what happens. You're going to intervene forcefully, no debate. And so there are reasons why you have autocratic leadership styles. Democratic says, let's do what the group says. Let's solicit from the organization. Let's involve the organization and allow them to have this kind of shared governance in terms of moving forward. And again, that works well in some circumstances, does not work so well in other circumstances. It depends on how informed, mature, sophisticated the group is. And then finally, you have some leaders with this kind of laissez-faire effect of they're going to intervene only when they need to, and allow the others to have some authority below their level and get things done. So autocratic, democratic, laissez-faire, 3 different leadership styles. Hopefully you're thinking about different leaders that exhibit those types of leadership, but most people are a mix of all 3, but they'll have a dominant leadership style as you go along. All right, very good. Let's move forward now and talk about some different managerials. We talked about leadership. Now we're moving into managerial styles, and the 2 dominant ones that are talked about in the book is this first one based on planning, organizing, staffing, directing, and controlling. And then you've got an alternative which still has very similar stages, if you will, but instead of staffing and directing, you have this idea of leading. And so no big surprise there, but let's get into a little bit more detail and look at each of these and what may be involved with each of these. So in this case, I'm using the latter model, the planning, organizing, leading, and controlling model. And you can see up in the planning model, you're setting the goals and objectives and strategies and plans. This may be the point that you engage the customers and get what those requirements are and make sure that what you're trying to solve is actually going to meet the customer expectations. And this phase has gained a lot more weight, if you will, compared to the others as you're going forward, because this idea of co-authoring solutions, of crowdsourcing solutions, all of those things begin happening in that kind of planning stage where you're setting out what problem are we really trying to solve, and then how are we going to possibly solve that. The organizing is how we're going to organize people, get people aligned, and again, that becomes a bit more complex if you're engaging the community in solving their own problems. You finally get to leadership. How do I motivate people? How do I set a vision? How do I communicate that and control the actual behavior? And then finally, we get into controlling. What standards are we going to use? What metrics or measurements are we going to use? How do we compare to others? You know, there's an old saying, that which gets measured gets done, and so that becomes important. And there's this idea of a band of excellence, that you can't be at the top of your game always, but you can set a band of excellence if you're out there actively measuring what's going on and making those corrections as necessary to keep things moving forward. So hopefully that gives you some sense of this idea of planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. All four are critically important with your large enterprise projects. That planning phase is absolutely critical. Getting the requirements right, absolutely critical as you're moving forward on a particular project. All right, let's talk about solving problems now and issues that arise. And this ties a little bit to the final exam, so you may want to pay attention to some components of this, because it goes forward into this kind of idea of course of action analysis and selecting a solution and implementing it. So the first thing is recognize and define what the problem is. On the previous slide, this would have been the requirements. And then as you start to do that defining of the problem, you want to gather facts, things that you're absolutely 100% sure are true and support analysis of the problem. And then those things that are assumptions. And assumptions are used to simplify the problem by making it clear what you're talking about, and they help constrain the problem. So for example, if you're trying to calculate where an artillery round will hit, you actually need the wind at every possible altitude that the shell may transition across. And that makes the calculations incredibly complicated and really don't add a lot of value. You can make an assumption that simplifies that the wind speed is the same at all altitudes. And if you make that assumption, then again, it simplifies, makes it easier to solve the problem. So again, we've, in that first step, recognized, defined the problem, figured out what the requirements are. We start gathering facts and make some assumptions to simplify the problem and decision making. At that point, we're going to develop possible courses of action for possible solutions. And as we do those, we want to have criteria to use to analyze those possible solutions. So the example that I use often in the class is this idea of buying a new car. It may be a Ford Taurus or a Honda Accord or a BMW 328i or a Porsche. Those are courses of action. Those are choices. And criteria may be acceleration from 0 to 60, number of doors, miles per gallon, cost. Those are all criteria. And so when you get to analyze and compare possible solutions or courses of action, you're comparing those criteria against those courses of action. And that's what you're going to do in your final project with a security executive summary and a security persuasive decision brief. So you're going to do this developing of those courses of action and criteria. You're going to analyze and compare them. And then you're going to make a recommendation, and that's that last step where you're selecting a possible solution. Now in the class, we're not going to have you implement and evaluate it, but we are going to have you select it and make your case for that particular solution.
This is the Students for Equitable Grades Underground. Long live the A+ is our motto. The professor is talking about the final exam already. This idea of criteria and courses of action seems important. It is actually the first thing on his grading rubric for the final exam. We suggest you learn what these exotic and alien words mean, as it appears he is using them very specifically. As expected, he is deviously breezing by this material and it is not in the book. Do not be fooled. This can affect your grade. This message is brought to you by the Students for Equitable Grades Underground. May you prosper and linger upon the fertile fields of A+.
There's some principles associated with information security management. I've got those listed here, the 6 Ps: planning, policy, programs, protection, people, and project management. And rather than go through those on this slide, look, got another slide, and we're going to take the first 3, this idea of planning, of building a business strategy. And once you have that kind of overarching business strategy, you then build your IT strategy. And once you build your IT strategy, you're nesting within that your InfoSec planning, so that it's aligned with the IT strategy and aligned with the business strategy. Now, if information security does not report to IT, it's still going to align with the business strategy, and it's going to be coordinated with the IT strategy, so that they're mutually reinforcing that kind of overarching business strategy. So this planning part is absolutely critical. Alignment is critical within this, and this idea of nesting. Policy, we're going to spend a whole chapter and lesson talking about policy, but there are really 3 kinds. You've got this idea of enterprise policy, which is, it just integrates everything together in this nice little book that everybody can read, and you learn everything you need to know about the policy that affects the entire enterprise. You have more limited forms of policy, one of which is a issue-specific, where you're taking an issue like email or mobile device management, and you're writing a policy associated with that. And then the third type of policy is where it's system-specific. And a system-specific policy is going to take a enterprise solution like Banner or PeopleSoft or DegreeWorks, something like that. And you're going to take that IT system and you're going to write policy specific to that that takes into account how that system accomplishes different tasks. Okay? Finally, so we've talked about planning, we've talked about policy as a component of information security management. Finally, you have different programs that you're going to be managing, and each of those, so you may have an education program, you may have a phishing program, you may have an intrusion detection program, you may have a kill chain management program. All of those are different programs that the InfoSec operations are going to manage. All right, I've covered the first 3 Ps in the principles of information security management. Let's move to the next 3. And this idea of protection. And so you're going to have all the decisions that you make are around risk management. You know, what's the likelihood of this attack occurring or this incident occurring, and then what's the damage that could possibly come from that. We'll talk a little bit later on in a different chapter on this kind of idea of a business impact analysis as we're going forward. But protections around risk management, assessment, control, and protection mechanisms. Next, we move to the 5th P, people. It's our most critical link, and one of the things that's hardest to change, because you're talking about changing how people think and how people operate, their actual behaviors. So very difficult, especially so in a very large organization, but it is the most critical link in information security. And then finally, project management. You'll have a number of projects that you're running related to information security. All of those need modern project management as a component for them to be implemented. Well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and finish up on this particular video, and what we're going to do in the next video is actually pick up on this idea of project management and spend an entire video talking about different ways that you can do project management. So keep on studying, keep on learning, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.